I'm with Elana Heideman, and we're talking about the recent hostage release. Ilana, how did you feel when you saw the three Israeli hostages back in Israel?
I think all of our emotion started long before that. And first of all, thank you for having me to discuss this very important subject because so many of us have been filled with emotion for over a year and 4 months, 471 days until this moment came to life. So my feelings on watching the entire process were basically a disoriented upheaval because it didn't only have the return of the hostages and their embrace by their mothers. The emotion of what I felt, and I think everybody can identify with this, began with the days beforehand, learning about the ceasefire, understanding these horrific conditions under which we were going to be receiving our hostages, like pawns in a game, three one day, four a week later, then three a week later, and then only in the final days would we apparently be receiving, with God's help, 12 additional hostages. So the emotion is very high and anxious over how was this deal made? How was it made possible that these hostages would come home alive? I think that the emotions also were exacerbated when the list of names was not provided on time. All of these different steps that led to the moment of release were then built up inside of us so that when we saw those girls in their mom's arms, we could not help but burst out. I burst out into tears. I have since watched the videos no less than 100 times. I know them by heart. Who limps, who has a maimed hand, who is with smiles holding up her disformed hand, having been shot and two fingers removed. Each one of these beautiful sisters of mine coming home. I don't know if I can actually define how I feel about it other than completely overwhelmed and, as I said, completely disoriented by what it means.
It must be very overwhelming for them, 471 days. And of course, now they get to go home and sleep in their own beds, not fearing being murdered like what happened to the six hostages previously.
We know from the very few pieces that have emerged already since their freedom, we know that they have said that they did not know until that morning that they were going to be released. So there is an interesting element of shock. They've shared how they were moved from place to place in humanitarian sections. Let's take a moment and understand that they were moved from place to place in humanitarian areas. Doron Steinbrecher had been kept entirely underground, she has shared, almost entirely underground. Each one of them were dressed in large clothing and they were clean and they had their hair back. And all of these were part of the show that Hamas wanted to put on. The moments you ask about the emotion felt upon their release begins also with the seeing the videos that were being put out by the various news agencies, especially Al Jazeera and Hamas associated news agencies, every single one of them putting out videos of streams and streams of Gazans coming and Hamas in full clean uniforms, standing and showing their power. The first image of these girls being released, it was actually a tiny glimpse captured through the window of one of the cars, and you could barely see this ghostly face. It was like black, deepened eyes, and this ghostly face, almost to the point nobody could identify who was who. It turns out that that was Romy Gonen's face that we were seeing in the bright pink jacket in that first glimpse of them in the car. And that was only the first moment where we knew they were alive. Up until that moment, Hamas's games included not being willing to tell who are the living and who are the dead. We did not get the names, as was indicated by the ceasefire, that we must receive the names. Israel would receive the names the night before, but they only received the names that morning. They are intentionally playing psychological terror games with the entire world because that is part of their claim of victory. It isn't a military victory. There have been over 20,000 terrorists who have been eliminated, but they're parading children in terrorist uniforms shouting, Khaybar, Khaybar, kill the Jews, screaming it with joy. Young children holding up guns. They cannot read and they cannot write, but they're holding guns in the air. They're putting their false power on parade while simultaneously having claimed a completely fabricated genocide over these months that has again been a part of the psychological manipulations that Hamas and the terror networks funded by Iran, but also in every single Islamo-fascist society. This is their education. And they have educated the world with this hate. So, what we saw in those first moments of the release was that on display. These women were touched even while they were being moved, apparently from car to car, as they had been moved from apartment to apartment prior and tent to tent. They were held in humanitarian areas. They were not seen by the Red Cross for 471 days. The Red Cross shows up with their trucks and the Nazi Hamas standing on the roof of the truck, climbing onto the trucks, reaching. What service has this fake humanitarian organization served during this entire war? Nothing, and they must be held accountable. And any listener to the lessons of truth must take action. Stop the funding, just as the newly inaugurated President Trump has just announced the stopping of the funding of UNRWA, this false organization that has enabled terror and sex slaves in so many ways, human trafficking of their own kind, using human civilians and encouraging and facilitating terror. Other images that have come out since yesterday were also those who were in press jackets, then being decorated with keffiyehs, the international symbol, much like the Nazi flag and the Palestinian flag, the symbol of this evil, diabolical, barbaric cult of death that is centered on the thirst for Jewish blood. So as these girls emerged to freedom, that thirst for blood was continuously shouted in their ears. They have testified that they thought every single day they were going to die. And Romy Gonen, when she is and she's embraced by her mother, and then we see the video of her calling on the phone her father, and she says, I survived alive. I came back alive, because she could not believe it. They all believed every day, and they did not know how long they were there. They did not have a sense of time. So you ask about their returning to their beds and sleeping at night. I doubt that there is much sleep other than trying to find some sort of a equilibrium between the hell that they have survived and this new freedom that they can taste, this liberation that they can taste, but they cannot, because there are still 97 hostages that are left behind. Now, we have also the recovery of Shaul. Oron's body was also freed by the IDF officers. The IDF soldiers were able to receive his body hidden underground for 10 years. So many emotions right now. So I think that, again, the entire country and these families and everyone touched is really trying to find some balance, because the fear was aroused by that propagandized display. And much of us realize we too are living in this emotional imbalance.
Do we know what the hostages knew about October the 7th? Did they know that there'd been a big massacre and killing of Israelis? Or did they just think it was their own little group, or maybe just one or two people themselves? Did they know any more information about what happened on October the 7th?
Well, two of the three women, Doron and Emily, were kidnapped from their homes in Kfar Aza. Kfar Aza is one of the most hard hit of all of the communities. And so they were very aware because it was happening all around them. They did not know who amongst their family was murdered. That information was likely only shared with them not even in the first moments, but in the first hours of their release. Romy Gonin was kidnapped from the Nova Festival. So also, this was happening all around her. Did they know the magnitude of October 7th? I don't think that that information of how much they knew has been shared with us yet. I do know that one of the ladies shared that they were able to get snippets here and there of seeing how there was a fight happening for their freedom. Now, mind you, it was likely, if we could just use our logical understanding of the scenario, right? The girls, we know that Emily and Romy were actually kept together a lot of the time. All three of them had been together at the beginning. And they said to the mothers, "You have no idea how important your daughter was for me." Because that kind of camaraderie amongst any captives, any victims of abuse is so important. They had shared that they got these snippets, and most likely they were in the humanitarian areas when they were around other people, or they were getting little snippets from the propaganda news, the Hamas news networks. So they were might have been learning about it within the context of Hamas hubris and saying, look, this is how we have broken up these Jewish hearts and this Jewish state, and we're going to destroy them. That's the context likely within which they heard the information about the fight for their lives. But do we know exactly yet how much? No. And maybe that's one of the questions we have to ask ourselves. We want to know immediately. We want to know immediately. What did you survive? Tell us the worst details so that we can be justified in our outrage, so that we can know more about the horrific, because we've gotten used to the horrors that were shared on October 7th. I would even say that there's a degree of people wanting some of the graphic detail in order to sustain their compassion, because people are suffering compassion fatigue. We can't, how much more can we care? It's been over, 15 months. Come on, how much more can we handle of this before we need to move on with our lives and live day by day? And yes, remember, and yes, think, and yes, add a prayer, but we are coping. And in terms of coping, sometimes we need to take a break from the graphic detail. But here, with the release of the hostages, we have a desire to know more in an immediate way, just like social media. We want it right away. But we want to remember that these ladies are human and they have endured things that we know from the previously released hostages. They are horrific abuses. So I don't know how much we will know in an immediacy. I think that it will emerge with time as the women are capable. And as, of course, unfortunately, with media being how it is, as soon as somebody catches wind of the rumor. And we need to be careful of these rumors. We have to be careful because they hurt our souls to learn about the type of sodomy and rape and humiliations that they were forced to endure during these times.
Now, 90 Palestinian prisoners were released, and we know in the past, in the Gilad Shalit deal, who was also kidnapped and many Palestinians were released, 82% returned back to terror. Does that worry you and all Israelis that so many of these Palestinian prisoners returned back to terror?
As you ask the question, I literally have to take a deep breath just to calm the fear it awakens within me. And frankly, it's likely for you too, because you are also in an area where this incitement to terror will now continue because these 90 prisoners have been released. It frightens me to no end. I question why they were released into our country as opposed to being sent elsewhere. I hope that there is some greater logic. And of course, my faith in God allows me to have that faith in a greater logic that maybe they will be tracked. Maybe we want to keep them close so that we can keep an eye on them. So that because so much security surveillance is in place, within all the legal means that needs to be, abided by, we have our eyes and our feet on the ground, able to perhaps prevent the type of disastrous realities that have occurred with previous release of terrorists. Yes, Yahya Sinwar had been released in the Gilad Shalit deal and ended up using all that he had learned in the Israeli prison, all the education that they received, the good quality conditions, the camaraderie that is allowed, and the exposure that they are even allowed to have to the ongoing terror networks, even outside of the prison systems, but of course, those networks that are established within them, that enabled Sinwar to create this vision for October 7th and bring it to life. Yes, there is a great fear that all of them will return to terror. And there is a great fear that we have saved these three lives at the expense, and God willing, all of the 33 hostages that are slated to be returned in the first phase of this horrific ceasefire deal with the devil that has had to had been put into place, that it's at the expense of thousands of lives. We do not know. Amongst the terrorists that have been released, it's important to pay attention to how many people they have each killed. And all of these details have been shared on many news networks that you can find. I suggest always to go to more grassroots news, not just to rely on any mainstream. Yes, we hate how social media spreads lies, but there are incredible organizations, my own included, Israel Forever, and Honest Reporting, and IMT, Camera, and very important organizations who are doing everything to share the detailed information. Jew Hate Database, Canary Mission, the kinds of organizations who are trying to show documenting anti-Semitism and documenting murders and knowing how many murders these people have committed is a tool. It is a fact you can have in your pocket. The bombers of the Hebrew University bombing, the bombers of many different individual bombings where nobody had heard about, but that dozens were killed. Ari Fuld, who was a well-known international activist for Israel and Jewish rights, his murderer was freed. The murderer and rapist of Ori Ainsbacher, who raped her and beheaded her, he has been freed. The murderer of the Fogel family, at home, asleep in their beds, from Itamar, he has been freed. The list goes on. I can go on and on because many I know. I know these stories intimately. My esteemed father, Richard Heideman, is one of the most important international human rights attorneys who is fighting for the rights of the victims. And he represents these victims of these murderers. And now all of his work to get them to be held accountable, and these murderers are now free. So the feeling is very, very tenuous, painful, and yes, it evokes fear, just like seeing that Hamas parade of power. It evokes fear. How can we have been in war now for 15 months and we have not eradicated them? How have we not made it impossible that one who is a murderer cannot be released in a hostage agreement? We have new things that must be learned each time that this takes place. Yes, we're afraid. And yes, we also must rely just a little bit on faith and on hope. Otherwise, we are stuck living in this very fear that the terrorist networks want us to have, which is why they demand the release of these individuals.
It looked a little bit like, was this going to happen? Nobody was quite sure. And then they were released. For the rest of the hostages being released, is Israel making a deal with the devil? And do you think that you'll actually get more hostages out? You're supposed to get more hostages, but do you think you'll actually get them in the end?
Again, we cannot be prophetic. We can only know that This deal already has met several setbacks. Hamas is playing their games, and yet we again forgive their missteps because we want the hostages back. So here is what's happening with the next phase, for example. The hostages, according to the agreement, are supposed to be released on this coming Shabbat, this coming Saturday, and the names are supposed to be given the day in advance. This is a release of 4 hostages. Now, I want us to think about this psychological terror mechanism that is in place here. A leak was made that the hostages would only be released on Sunday, meaning they're counting the days differently, so to speak, right? It's supposed to be after 7 days. This last hostage release was on Sunday. Hamas is making the erroneous claim that the prisoners were not released before midnight on this past Sunday, the January 19th. And therefore, it's Israel who's playing games. Of course, the Red Cross, who was involved in the transferring not only of the Jewish innocent hostages to the hands of Israel, but also for the handover of the terrorists and murderers back to their societies, the Red Cross allowed for riots to take place at this handover, and it delayed the process. We now actually have some evidence that there is some let's say, internal dealings between the Red Cross and Hamas, and that it was intentional so that the last of the prisoners would only be released after midnight so that they could intentionally claim Israel violated the deal. Israel, of course, has not violated the deal and continues, as I said, to excuse every misstep on the side of the devil. Next, they also had said they are not going to release the names on the day before, but only the morning of. And let's just discuss what this does to the people of Israel, to all of the Jewish people of the world. Because the percentage of our society that does keep the Sabbath, we do not use electricity, we do not use our phones, we don't watch the news, and so it tears at our soul. What do we do on this coming Shabbat when there is supposed to be a release? And they have not, by the way, finalized what time. That's another violation. They have not finalized what time this hostage release will take place. Do we anticipate that these are going to happen? Do we know who the next 4 will be? We all know that Shiri Bibas and her 2 beautiful redhead children, Ariel and Kfir, were snatched from freedom and their lives stolen. We know that months after October 7th, it was announced also the father Yarden having been kidnapped, but kept separate. They put on video telling him that his wife and children were killed. But there has never been any evidence given, not from any intelligence that was recruited, of the Bibas family actually having been killed. But there has also not been a sign of life. There has been the sign of life video of Yarden, as I mentioned. They intentionally indicated 4 hostages are going to be released. And we cannot help but assume, hope, and pray that it would be the Bibas family. But we know that that's just unlikely. It's just unlikely that they would reunite this family, which we assume has been kept separately, because one of the testimonies we know is that Yarden had been kept in a cage at one point. You know, these are games. These are games with our minds and games with our hearts. And I want to have faith that 33 hostages will come home, that God knows his way, and that each one of these steps in the process is supposed to teach us something. It's supposed to remind us just how important faith and action are, because we can have faith in God, but we must also increase our faith in man. And we must do more in order to act as the human beings who are entrusted with the free choice that God has given us to say, we're going to choose to act for the sake of good. We are going to call out Qatar. We are going to call out Egypt. We are going to call out UNRWA. We are going to call out the Red Cross. We're going to fight the United Nations en masse. We have to do more. We have to raise our voices more. And just like Trump at his inauguration had absolutely no obligation to refer to the hostages, and he did, but he did more than that. He brought the hostages' families to the front stage. He honored the Jews and their humanism and their humanity and their dignity. And we need more people to do that because Israel is fighting the war for the world. So every step of this ceasefire can only bring us to the next potential release of the next hostages. And hopefully, someone, somewhere, sometime in the world will say, no, we will not play your games. And the next round, you will release all hostages unconditional. We've heard it now from several big voices in the world that Hamas will not be in control of Gaza, and we need to make sure that happens. And the only way to do that is if more people raise their voice and fight the lies, fight the propaganda, because you have now pro-Hamas elements in the United States, in the UK, in Australia. I'm sure many of you have heard the increase of anti-Semitism in Australia. A children's home was set on fire last night. We've had many different firebombing attacks, attacks against Jews all over the world. This is not going to stop without your involvement. So my hope is strong, but I don't have more of an answer than that.
And what is your website for people who'd like to know more about the work that you do?
IsraelForever.org is a place where you can come and search and click through, find ways that you can do more, use your voice, be a volunteer, be a virtual citizen of Israel. We have various communities that we are seeking to build where you live, but virtual, so that people who are maybe unaware, unconnected, they want to do more, but they don't know how, they want to learn more, they can come to the Israel Forever Foundation, where we try to put out education, engagement, and empowerment for Jews and non-Jews who see themselves as a part of the righteous among the nations, helping to save humanity in our generation. Come and visit, come and join, reach out if you're looking for a speaker in your community, and we're here to help you, because the more that we connect as a global community, the more that we can use our strength and use our numbers to counter their immense numbers. We have seen a 400% increase in anti Semitism around the world. The only way it will stop, because what happens to the Jews will happen to others next. And we see persecution against Christians happening everywhere. And that's why I say, Paul, even where you are in Bethlehem, it is important that we realize the release of these terrorists is a danger to us all. Canada has accepted 5,000 Gazans with no vetting for any terrorist involvement. We are seeing terrorism spread. So, Israel Forever, we are here to help empower you, and follow us on social media. Help us cross 10,000 on Instagram, because we have over 400,000 on Facebook, and we need to counter the shadow banning that is happening and the silencing of the Jewish voice and Jewish human rights in the world. So, these three hostages, they represent our humanity. Think about it. If it was your daughter, if you were that mother, if it was your sister, do not forget the hostages. Put on your pin, put it on your post. Do more, raise your voice more. Thank you for allowing me. I apologize for my emotionalism, but this is our day to day survival. Fight for Jewish rights now so that we can save humanity for the future. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today.
Well, Ilana, thank you very much for sharing.
Thanks so much, Paul.